Welcome to Ethics School of Professional Studies right here at the University of Bridgeport. To Peter Umoh, your professor for this class. So today, our focus is going to be on three theories in morality. We shall take a second look at Utilitarianism, and then Libertarianism, and then Kantianism. And then we shall also take a look at how they differ from each other. These are all major theories in our attempt to understand justice, in our attempts to understand ethics, in our attempt to understand the rightness and wrongness of action. We shall take a look at two questions. Question number one, as to whether there is indeed a supreme principle of morality. Is there a core principle for morality that everything else can be reduced to? Is it a search for happiness? And so if you find happiness, then within that happiness is morality, meaning right. Is it a search for rights? So as long as your personal rights are in place and respected, then there is morality. Is morality equivalent to a right? Or is there a different principle that is independent of myself, but belonging to some kind of universality, meaning to say a principle that stands on its own without any kind of, say, divine revelation? And also, our lecture today will help us answer the question if freedom really does exist. Are we really free in making the choices we make and exercising the options we do? Utilitarianism. Now, there are two founders, as it were, of utilitarianism. First, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was a thinker, and his idea was to pursue rightness based on what you get out of it in terms of pleasure and also the avoidance of pain. Now, John Stuart Mill came sometime after Bentham, but was born before Bentham died, and then he took Bentham's idea and expanded it, and then sort of explained in more detail an understanding of the principle of utility. Utility just means usefulness. So what is useful and what is not useful? The utility principle is what comes out of a situation. So in any interaction, you are looking for pleasure and you are trying to avoid pain, but it is more about the usefulness or about the consequences of that action. So he explained it further by saying that it is about the greatest good of the greatest number. So utilitarianism is about the greatest good of the greatest number. But there are certain issues here. An outstanding issue is the issue of individual rights. Now, individual rights. Utilitarianism trounces individual rights. The group wins and the individual loses. Now, utilitarianism is also called consequentialism. It is called consequentialism because it is focused on the consequences of the action, not necessarily the action, but the consequences of the action, meaning that it is focused primarily on the outcome of the action. We shall briefly, or in a little while, take a look at Immanuel Kant, who is going to be driven not by the consequences of an action, but by the action itself. But for utilitarianism, it is about the consequences. So the greatest good principle, the greatest good of the greatest number is what makes an action right. Therefore, there is no ultimate principle. This really means there is no ultimate truth. There is nothing that is universal about rightness and wrongness. Everything depends. Therefore, you can say that the rightness or wrongness of an action does not depend on the act itself, but the consequences of the action. It is within this context that we can say the end justifies the means. Now, J.S. Mill will go further to make a distinction between rule and act utilitarianism. He sees act utilitarianism as an action that is acceptable if that action results in as much good as any other alternative. In as much good as any other alternative that is available. That is to say that in general, say keep your promises. In general, don't tell a lie. Now, a rule utilitarianism has more to do with your action being a member of other rules that have been already accepted as good enough and useful for the society. Which is to say that when you carry out an action in terms of right and wrong, that action should not break a rule that is already accepted as a good rule or accepted as a bad rule. Let me take that again. When it comes to rule utilitarianism, an act is right on the condition that a rule that you are following is in line with other rules that have already been accepted to have led to the greatest utility or the greatest usefulness of the society. So what you do is like what others have done, and what others did is like what already had been accepted or has been accepted as good enough. Utilitarianism, as pointed out earlier, trunks is again the welfare of the individual. So does it really matter if your action is like other actions or if your action is in a body of rules already accepted? Take for instance, slavery was accepted, and so if you bought a slave, it wasn't a bad thing because it was already accepted. But we know that even though slavery was accepted, it was still bad. Bad for who? Bad for the minority within that context. There are two key components of utilitarianism. One, the consequentialist principle or the teleological principle. Two, the utility principle or the hedonistic principle. First, the consequentialist principle. Now, in the consequentialist principle, it is the end, not the means, that counts. So, consequentialist has to do with the idea of the end. The rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by the goodness or quote the badness of the results that flow from it, not necessarily the act itself. So it is the end that matters and not the means. Therefore, you can say the end justifies the means. The utility principle, on the other hand, has to do with hedonism. Hedonism has to do with the pleasure principle. Hedonistic, hedonism. The pleasure principle, pleasure driven. So therefore, the only thing that is good in itself is some specific type of state, like pleasure, happiness, welfare. And so the driving motivation or the driving good or the driving outcome is pleasure. And this pleasure is seen as good and pain is the evil. Therefore, in conclusion, you can say an act is good if it produces pleasure and an act is bad if it produces pain or blocks pleasure. pleasure. So in summary here, the consequentialist principle says the end justifies the means. And the utility principle says as long as it produces pleasure, then it is good. This is utilitarianism. A different theory. This theory looks at justice in terms of the individual. So justice is seen as a right. It believes that as individuals, we have a fundamental right to liberty. Therefore, we should be free to go into any kind of concert with any other person, a contract or whatever, with another person. Why? Because we own ourselves. We are ourselves. We are our own persons. And therefore, any kind of external pressure on us or external directive takes away our sense of freedom. So libertarianism in essence is about freedom. So justice is seen as a right, as an exercise of our freedom, which is this right. We have a right to freedom, which comes before anything else. They reject three things or three laws. One, no paternalism. This means that they do not want someone to sort of hover over them as like quote unquote an helicopter mom, or hover over them as a dad. Now pater, P-A-T-E-R in Latin means father. So nobody should lord it over them as a dad would. Number two, no moral legislation. Moral legislation here has to do with coercive or forceful laws made by government and imposed on the people to then make the people follow a certain thing that is right or not follow a certain thing that is wrong, like forcing you to wear seat belts or to wear helmets on a motorcycle. They oppose such moral legislation. Also, they oppose any kind of distribution of wealth. They do not want wealth redistributed. So therefore, if Michael Jordan made 10 billion playing basketball, then that is his money to keep, and such wealth should not be redistributed. One of the greatest weaknesses of libertarianism is this idea of excessiveness. And on page 73 of your text, you can see the story of cannibalism in Germany. A man put out an advertisement that he wanted to kill someone and eat that person. And amazingly, people volunteered. He interviewed a few, chose one person, actually did kill the person after the person gave his consent and written permission, and then ate the person. He was arrested, but there were no laws on the books in Germany as at that time to prosecute him because the man had agreed. So you have a question here that beckons to a question we've already dealt with, namely, what kind of society do we want? We have individuals and their rights, but what about the larger society? And that is libertarianism, driven by a sense of justice as a right and justice as welfare, meaning that my welfare is driven by my right to do as I please with any other person who also agrees to do it with me. A brand new topic, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant comes in with a whole different approach. Now, Immanuel Kant was a German thinker, from Prussia actually, and he grew up in the day of Isaac Newton. According to Kant, morality is not just about maximizing happiness or any other end. Morality is more. So Kant wanted to come up with a theory of ethics that was as scientific as the science of the day, mathematical as it were. Isaac Newton came up with the idea of the apple and gravity, and then opened up science, Immanuel Kant wanted to do the same thing. So Kant says that morality is deeper. Morality has to do with respecting persons as ends in themselves and not as means to an end. What did he mean by that? Kant meant that, in summary, that man is a being of worth, man has dignity, and therefore man is worthy of respect, and as opposed to utilitarianism, should never be used as a means to an end. So, before Kant came to his conclusion, Immanuel Kant first took a look at the theories before him. Utilitarianism. He says that utilitarianism saw justice as what maximizes welfare, the greatest good of the greatest number, the average happiness of society, as it were. And he presents libertarianism as something that sees rightness and wrongness as the exercise of freedom. So justice means I am free to exercise my native freedom, which is freedom that you are born with, to go into contract with any other person who is willing to go into contract with me without any kind of coercion or force from the outside. And again, libertarianism rejects any kind of regulation from the outside which they see as unjust, like any regulation of the market. They actually believe in free markets, that the market is free. In chapter 1 we read about that, whether the market is free to set a price or whether the market is or should respond to the needs of the people. A libertarian will say that government should not interfere with prices on the market, irrespective of what else is going on. Now, he also took a look at Aristotle, a Greek thinker, and Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle famously said, virtus in medio stat, which is Latin translated as virtue stands in the middle. Aristotle then saw justice as giving each person his due, and therefore goods or whatever is available as value in the society ought to be distributed based on excellence so as to promote virtue. By this he meant that each person should get what comes to him based on your excellence. Now, Immanuel Kant rejects A, which is utilitarianism, and C, which is Aristotle's idea of giving each person his due based on excellence in order to promote virtue. Kant says that neither A or C, which is utilitarianism or Aristotelianism in this sense, neither A or C respects human freedom. However, he is in agreement that justice is respecting freedom, especially in B, namely option B, when the libertarians say that justice means I am able to do what I am able to do because I own myself, and so justice is connected to freedom. But Kant takes it to a different level entirely. How does he do so? Well, Kant says we can arrive at morality through pure practical reason. What did he mean by that? Pure practical reason. Kant is saying morality does not need revelation. Morality does not need some kind of divine power or divine authority. Morality needs reason, and humans already have reason within them. According to Kant, every person is worthy of respect not because we own ourselves, as the libertarians say, but because we have reason, we have intelligence, we have a capacity to think. It is this capacity to think that separates us from animals. and then sort of qualifies us for respect because we are not animals. Now, he also points out that because we are rational beings, we are able to think for ourselves. We have autonomy, and therefore we have a capacity to choose and a capacity to act. This is what it means when he says we are autonomous beings capable of acting and choosing freedom. Kant goes on in his analysis to say that man has a capacity for freedom and reason, and this capacity for freedom and reason all humans have. Now, the libertarians say that the goal of life should be to seek pleasure and avoid pain and maximize happiness. Kant says that pleasure seeking, which we had pointed out earlier as hedonism, so pleasure seeking is not the master of man, but reason is. Man is the master of pleasure, not pleasure as the master of man. You guys have seen in modern society how a pursuit of pleasure is all over the place in advertising, and people throw reason to the wind, and then sometimes, for instance, they find themselves in debt having pursued pleasure and then forgot about the fact that they were going to owe when they used that credit card in making a purchase that they could not actually afford. Immanuel Kant is saying we have reason, and so we are not merely creatures of appetite, things we like, but we are also creatures of reason, creatures of intellect. Therefore, our capacity for thinking is connected up, bound together with our capacity for freedom, which is to say, we are actually able to choose because we are able to think. When you think, or when you have the ability to think, you are able to look at one side of the issue and then the other side of the issue and then weigh the two sides and then choose. That choosing capacity is an affirmation of our freedom. And so Immanuel Kant is basically saying man is free, man has intelligence, man can choose. Now, seen together that man is free, man has intelligence, and man can choose, we are therefore not animals who are driven by instinct, appetite. They see food, they want to eat it now. A human sees the same food and then can make a choice when to eat it, how much to eat it, or how much to eat. And so Immanuel Kant points out that that distinction that separates us from animals, namely reason, is what gives us autonomy as individuals to then be able to choose. And it is that autonomy that imposes on us moral responsibility. Let me explain that again. Autonomy here is seen as individuation, me by myself choosing option A instead of B when I fully understand A and B, and because I made that choice by my will, therefore I'm morally accountable or I'm morally culpable. Now, he also points out that if there is a central principle of morality, that such a principle has to be a law unto itself. This means this is a law that by itself stands and does not need support from any other authority. This is what it means by a law unto itself. It doesn't need any kind of divine revelation. It doesn't need any kind of government imposing it. It doesn't need any kind of paternalism, someone acting like your dad, any kind of force or pressure on you to sort of conform. It is a law unto itself. And he also points out that this law has to be categorical. Categorical here means it is a command. For instance, the 10 Commandments, those are categorical laws. It says, do this, avoid that. So Kant is saying that the supreme principle of morality has to be a categorical law that is not revealed by some kind of external source, but is a law that is by itself, and it has nothing to do with what you get out of it, as pointed to by the libertarians actually, and also by the utilitarians, who go after benefits or usefulness. Supreme principle of morality. Kant constructed it this way: act in such a way that by the maximum of your action it should become a universal law. Act in such a way that by the maximum of your action it should become a universal law. What did he mean by this? He meant that whatever action you do, think, can this action be universalized? This is the so-called Kantian universalizability. Can this action be turned into a universal law? If so, then it is a good action. The supreme principle of morality is therefore universal and not particular and not relative and does not depend on anything. Actually, if you guys remember your, say, middle school chemistry classes or high school chemistry classes, when you did a litmus test for acid and you took a piece of paper and you said you put it into, say, orange juice and it changes color, and when it changes color, then there was some kind of reaction to it, then you know it is either an acid or a base or something like that. So universalizability is like that litmus test. If it can be made into a universal law, then it is then the right action. If it cannot be made into a universal law, then it is not the right action. Take, for instance, taking the life of an innocent person. Can you make it into a law and let the law say it is permissible to take the life of an innocent person? If the answer is no, then that is by itself a bad thing to do. Immanuel Kant rejected the idea that morality should depend on human nature. Why? Well, humans change, civilizations change, things come and go, governments come and go, even churches change their rules. Kant wanted something that was necessary and not contingent. Necessary and not contingent. Now, necessary means it is just there. Contingent means it depends on something else. This is why he calls it a categorical imperative. Kant says affirmatively, you should always keep your promises. It is important to sort out here two words: intrinsically right. So an action is intrinsically right, which means by the nature of the act itself, or intrinsically wrong, also by the nature of the act in itself. What does that mean? That means taking the life of an innocent person is always wrong by the nature of the act in itself, and saving the life of an innocent person is always right by the nature of the act in itself, and it does not need any kind of external source like divine revelation or a government to make it right. This is what he means by a categorical imperative, a command that can be universalized. You can take all of Kant's ethics and categorize it under the umbrella called deontological ethics, whereas utilitarianism will fall under the category teleological ethics. So in deontological ethics of Immanuel Kant, the key principle is the idea of duty. So you ask yourself the question, what is my duty? So a police officer is on the highway and a doctor going to the hospital is on the highway. The doctor is running his car, brand new Porsche, and blows past the police officer, who promptly pulls him over and over his protestation gives the medical doctor a ticket. Within the hour, the same police officer runs into a nasty accident, brought to the hospital, and guess who is the attending physician in the emergency room? The same doctor. Now there's a challenge. The same doctor had begged the police officer an hour earlier to be given a break, and the police officer had said no. Now this doctor is the only person in that room on that day who knows what needs to be done to keep the police officer alive. What should he do? Now, if you say that the doctor has a duty to save the life of the police officer, then you are right. What doctors do is driven by duty, not benefits. From a utilitarian principle, you could say, well, what is the doctor going to get out of it? In this instance here, can't you say, benefit or no benefit, the reaction of the medical doctor to the police officer on that gurney should be driven by the doctor's duty to save lives. This is a categorical imperative. So therefore, universalizability is a maxim, like a litmus test for rightness. It is in so saying that we can draw the conclusion that the end does not justify. Now, if you were then to put it side by side, you put teleological ethics on one side, and then you put deontological ethics on the other side, and then you compare the two, you find similarities and differences, mainly differences. So, in teleological ethics, which is side A, you're looking at utilitarianism. Utilitarianism goes after the maximization of goods such as pleasure, happiness, welfare, and then the reduction of suffering and pain, whereas deontological ethics is concerned with just the wrongness or the rightness of the action in itself. And so, deontological ethics is driven by duty, whereas teleological ethics is driven by outcome or consequences. So, in teleological ethics, it all depends on what comes out of it. So, you never really know the rightness or wrongness of any action until all the consequences come in. Whereas in deontological ethics, some acts are, by their very nature, intrinsically always right or always wrong. Therefore, there's just something intrinsically wrong with the very act of lying. And so lying is wrong. Whereas in teleological ethics, you can say it depends on what you get out of lying. And that is it. Teleological ethics and deontological ethics seen side by side. One is driven by the end or benefits, and the other is driven by duty or logic. Our society today, especially the politics of our society today, is full of agreements and disagreements about right and wrong. If you take a look at major political entities, the left or the right, and the right and the middle, for that matter, some favor abortion rights, others consider abortion as immoral. Some believe that people should have a right to euthanasia, others say that euthanasia is immoral. Some believe in gay rights, others say, irrespective of the law, homosexuality is just right. Some believe in taxing the poor to help, or taxing the rich to help the poor. Others believe that such a thing is just by its nature unfair. Some think that affirmative action is good, especially in college admissions and at jobs. Other people think it is reverse discrimination. Some believe that you should be free to torture a terrorist suspect. Others just say that torture by itself is wrong in principle. Some believe in free sex with whom or whatever, and others see the same thing as abomination. So, in conclusion, who is right? Or does right and wrong actually exist at all? If our society is as divided as it is today, on the same issue, if you take a look at our political system as of today, often our Congress, our Senate is about 50-50, and often in the last few years, they just split down the Senate, 50 on this side, 50 on the other side, on the same question. So then, who is really right? Or, as the question says, does right and wrong actually exist at all? So we have a cultural war. Are moral positions fixed by upbringing or faith, or are moral positions dynamic? Is the final word said on morality, and so morality is dogmatic and ideological, or is morality dynamic? The pressure to completely sort this thing out, the differences and the nuances in between, that is what moral philosophy does. Trying to figure out what makes discrimination wrong, or when should it be allowed, trying to sort that out. That is what philosophy does. As we pointed out in week 1, philosophy does 3 major things. It asks questions, it pursues a point in depth, and it provides arguments. So, reflecting on our newfound wisdom as a base to tackle new complex situations is what moral reasoning or philosophy is. In summary, utilitarianism is about the greatest good of the greatest number, the greatest benefit of the greatest number. It is about the maximization of happiness and the reduction of suffering and pain. Utilitarianism does not support any kind of universal principles. Everything is individual or individualism. Everything depends. Libertarianism, on the other hand, is driven by personal rights. It sees justice as freedom, my freedom to be able to do whatever I want to do, irrespective of what others do, because I own myself. Kantianism is about being duty-driven in all interactions. There are other theories that we shall look at, but as of today, we've seen that utilitarianism says the end justifies the means. Libertarianism says I am a free person and life is about my exercise of my freedom, no external coercion to make me do what others want me to do. Whereas Kantianism says rightness and wrongness is not about benefits or outcomes or consequences. It is not even about pain or a reduction of pain and suffering, but rightness or wrongness is about principles. Kantianism says certain actions are just right intrinsically, and certain actions are just wrong intrinsically. Therefore, we have to seek a universalization, meaning that whatever we do, we ask the question, can we turn this action into a universal law? If the answer is yes, then it is a good action. If the answer is no, then it is a bad action. So, I'll read these conclusions. If moral reflection consists in seeking a fit between the judgments we make and the principles we affirm, how can such reflection lead us to justice or moral truth? How can we use the three theories we've covered today to lead us to moral truth or to lead us to justice? Are we right when we arrive at that conclusion? Are we right when we choose where we stand on the issues? What makes us right? Who really is to judge right and wrong? Justice, rights, obligations, consent, honor, virtue, morality, law. Who really decides right and wrong? Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, J.S. Mill, Jeremy Bentham, John Rawls, and many others. In their take on the issues of right and wrong, we as students of philosophy are then given the opportunity to take a look at a variety of perspectives on this issue of justice, on this issue of right and wrong, and on the issue of who decides. Good night, and I will see you next week. The rest of the work is online in Canvas. This is Dr. Umoh, School of Professional Studies. Good night again. Thank you.